over the weeks we've been talking about groups and group work, and we're looking at Western theories. And this week we really wanted to focus on some of the things that can go wrong when you're in group work situations or not ideal. And I was having a conversation with Annette Plowman, who's our guest today, around group work and some of the experiences she's had. And I thought it'd be fantastic if she could come in and we could talk about some of those narratives and some of her experiences. So here's Annette Plowman, and welcome.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm Annette. I've lived and worked in the Northern Territory for about 21 years. My background is psychology and human resources, and I'm a facilitator of workshops, usually in workplaces. The experience that I've had in the Northern Territory has been with quite diverse groups, working in many remote Aboriginal communities, and also working with newly arrived migrants and also asylum seekers, and a variety of other people from different backgrounds that live and work in the Northern Territory. So I'm really happy to share some of the lessons that I've learned from things that have maybe not gone quite as planned or as ideal in the beginning.
So, Annette, it would be fantastic if you could just please give us a bit of a rundown around the kinds of groups that you've facilitated or co-facilitated in the past, so we get an idea of the breadth of your experience.
Yep. Really diverse groups. So I've facilitated groups that have been around emergency services management, for example, and that can range from community members to not-for-profit workers to government agency groups that are all put into groups together. I facilitated numerous groups in remote Aboriginal communities that have usually been local workers, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in different places. So I've worked in East Arnhem Land in Galawinku, I've worked quite a lot in Tiwi Islands, also Daly River and Tennant Creek, and some town camps in Alice Springs as well. A lot of that stuff has been around capacity development and I guess things quite often quite sensitive, so things around child protection and how to manage reporting in the context of remote communities. I've had, I used to actually do a lot of inductions for organisations actually, and so as we know, Darwin's a real mix of cultures, so it would always be a bit of a surprise of who I might get into the room, and through the course of those inductions and programs to orientate people into the Northern Territory and into organisations that they would run for 5 days, and we would cover everything from, cultural competency around working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to child protection to emergency services management. So, the content of some of those subjects sometimes would, bring different conversations into the groups, and so you'd have people from a variety of backgrounds. And then I've also done a lot of work with senior executives and senior leadership people in organisations as well, which adds another layer into the dynamics and into the mix.
And hopefully we'll be speaking a little bit about that.
Yeah, we can.
Go through. So sometimes the content, which you've just kind of highlighted a little bit of workshops, can trigger disclosures by participants. And do you have any examples you could share with us around that and how that can play itself out and what you might do in those instances?
Yeah. I've probably got a couple of examples we can share, and they're quite different, so I think it can just highlight, you might be prepared for one topic but not the other one. So if I start with around working with children and keeping children safe, so I was involved in delivering a 2-day program that was based on the South Australian government program of keeping kids safe. And we adapted it to work within the organisation and to put some sort of cultural context around it. And it was really, it went right from, what are the types of abuse and neglect, right through into, in-depth conversations and videos around grooming and different ways that sometimes young people can be exploited. So the depth of the content was really quite huge. I delivered that program for probably 5 or 6 years across the Northern Territory in different places. I also delivered it interstate a couple of times for the organisation I was working for. And I probably delivered it around every 6 weeks. So, do the math, I don't know, that's maybe about 50 sessions at least.
Yeah.
And in that time, there would not have been one session when I didn't have a disclosure from someone around child abuse or neglect. And what was interesting was I kind of prepared myself to go into those sessions thinking people would say, oh, I'm working here and I've seen something and I just want to talk to you about that because I'm not sure if that's right. But what was actually happening, which I, was not quite prepared for, was that people were actually having realisations that their life experiences actually fit into that context of actually what was child abuse or neglect. So it could range from growing up in a family where there was family violence, for example. It could range from, actual sexual abuse. And so I had these disclosures that would happen. Sometimes they would just be just talk to me on a lunch break, which is quite easy to manage, but I did have ones that were actually full disclosures in front of a group of 25 people, really explicit stuff about childhood sexual abuse and things like that. So, the diversity and the length of breadth of what it could be always varied. And in that particular course, the way that it was run was that it always had a second person with me, and that person was someone that was also trained up, in this space. And we would sometimes swap between facilitation or just also be watching the room as well. So if we noticed that, so for example, if you were in there, Michelle, and we noticed that you kind of, your body language changed and you closed right back down and you disengaged with the group, then the other person might go up and say, is everything okay? Do you want to have a break? And we'd also give people permission right at the beginning to say, if you feel uncomfortable, just let us know that you're okay, give us a wave or a signal, and you go out, and then the other person would go out and just check on them. So that's around child protection, which you kind of, you would expect something in. The other things that I've seen it in is things around emergency management and responding to things like floods and cyclones in the Northern Territory. Again, in facilitation workshops, we're trying to use different tools of videos and things like that. So we played a video regarding the floods in Queensland in 2010 as an example of how grief and trauma can impact people 5-6 years later. And again, completely unexpected from within that group was that I had a number of people that had actually experienced the 1998 Catherine floods. And so straight away they were crawling like this loss of their livestock. And these people just suddenly started crying when this video was going on, and I wasn't sure what was happening, if I had, missed something. And when I sort of, said, are you okay? They just said that this stuff from, 20, 25 years ago, that it had just brought it all to the surface really, really quickly. So, I didn't expect that in that context. In a child safety workshop, I expected it to be about other people, but not necessarily disclosures from the participants. So, yeah,
So what did you do in that second example?
Around the flooding and things like that. So I just, again, just said, are you okay? Sort of what's happened and things. And they just sort of spoke about it. So I actually let them speak. So I actually, said to the rest of the group, look, we're going to have a break and we're going to have lunch now. So I just sort of, you change the room, you change the energy in the room, you free it right up. And then I just sat with them and just said, I'm really sorry about that. And they said, oh, no, it's okay. And then they actually just spoke and just talk about it. And, some of their, the loss of animals and all these different things. So it was just I just really listened, and I think that's the first part in always healing for people, is just to be able to sit and to listen to it. And it was a great lesson for me at the same time as well.
They're great examples. So what about, have you had instances where it's the facilitator that is triggered and discloses? Yeah, this is a really interesting one, and I've got a close circle of facilitators, and we talk about this quite a lot, and what can happen. And we all have our own story, including myself, and sometimes it's about getting our voice heard. So we might take on roles where we suddenly can find ourselves that we can stand up and actually have a voice, and that's okay for confidence and things like that, and changing your experience and your life and your story, basically. But what I've also seen is when that's taken to another level that I actually think is then potentially dangerous for the group as well, where people actually take that into being a therapeutic way of dealing with. I think that's what the thinking is, and so they might give full disclosures about
again, you know, sexual assault, childhood abuse and things like that. I've been in domestic violence workshops where, you know, it is good to form a connection in some way, to say, you know, you might say something along the lines of, you know, I've got lived experience or something like that, but you don't know who's in the room again. So you might have other survivors in the room. You might have people that are going through it at that time. So as the facilitator, there's a huge responsibility to actually keep those people safe in that room, and you've got to do your work outside of that space to actually be a really great facilitator as well. And so, yeah, I've seen that happen a few times as well.
How did the group deal with that?
The one that comes to mind is around, it was a family violence workshop, and it was really mixed. So there was some people in the group that got really angry and really, you know, jumped on board of it, and it was becoming like this movement within the group. This workshop would have had about 35 people in it, easy. And then, you know, other people really sort of sinking right back into themselves and just sort of didn't want to be part of it. I think there were some people that were like, you know, owls in the headlight of just completely being unprepared and, you know, for anything like that. And then, you know, I remember looking at another woman across it, and we just looked at each other, and it was just kind of a moment of like, I understand, but not sure that this is the right context. But there was no way to kind of, you know, slow it, and it kind of, you could feel that whole room change, and we were all sort of locked into it for the next hour and a half. So it felt quite yucky, actually. Yeah.
So you were co-facilitator?
No, I was a participant in that one. Yeah. So there was I think it was a train the trainer, to be honest, actually. So there was other facilitators in the group, and, you know, as I said, sometimes people, you know, move into these roles because they want to have a voice, or they've got lived experience, which I think is fantastic. And I think there's a risk, and I see it, as I said, my background's in HR, where there's, you know, we'll train the trainer, we'll train everyone, but it's actually a particular skill set that's required to be a safe facilitator of workshop and keep people safe, especially if they're sensitive topics, or, you know, you're dealing with people's trauma and things like that. Yeah.
So, while we're talking about co-facilitators, I'm just wondering if there's been other issues that have arisen out of working with a co-facilitator.
Yeah. I don't know if there's been issues as such, but there definitely has to be the work outside of the group. So you have to establish a relationship. You have to establish your differences and be okay with that. I think co-facilitation is incredibly powerful because people bring different views, it's a different voice, you get to listen to someone else, it's a different way of interacting. But yeah, I have seen, and even myself, I've had people that we've had to adapt and work, you know, together, and I've worked with co-facilitation with people from different backgrounds and cultures as well. So again, it's really about knowing yourself. So there might be things that the other person says, and I might be sitting there thinking, oh, I don't know if I agree with that. And so I'm going through that processing of the thought, whether I agree or whether I disagree. This is particularly around some, you know, cultural things. There might be some statements that are made, and I think, oh, that's a direct attack at you know, my background, like my culture. And so you just have to, again, you know, you've got this huge responsibility to know exactly what's going on for you. And then as the facilitator, like, people are looking at you to see what you're doing, and yeah, again, moving with the group. But I think that there definitely has to be, if you go in cold, and cold is just as much as, you know, spending 2 hours together the day before, then you really don't know what you're going to get into. And again, you know, why that person's there and what they're facilitating, and whether that becomes a space for them as well to talk about some things. So sometimes you end up facilitating the facilitator to be able to, you know, manage the room. And again, it's about keeping that group that you're working with really safe at all times. So
has gender ever risen as an issue within the group or group facilitation context?
Yeah. I was just thinking about co-facilitation situations, actually, as you say that. So yeah, I've worked with people different gender to myself, and yeah, it's a very, like, commanding way, and would actually, you know, I would speak and would cut in and speak over the top of me and things like that. so far as the group, I've seen it in activities. So, you know, as facilitators, we like to get people to do activities and things, and there's a particular activity we used to use around emergency response. And so it's photographs, and it'd be like, so who would you go to first? Like if you looked at these people to try and, it's almost like a triage, you know, you look at them, who looks the most distressed, and you're looking for signs. So, you know, if someone's yelling, well, that's a pretty clear signal, but other things like tears or sadness and things like this. And so it was, I had a particular session, there was actually gender and culture that divided the room. So there was a photo of an elderly woman, and some people in the room were saying, well, look, she's okay, she's sitting there, she's really quiet, she looks really happy. And these people over here are obviously, you know, really quiet, you know, distressed, and, you know, and they're a family group. And I had some people in from the Tiwi Islands actually, and they were saying, no, you have to go to the elder first. You have to go to that old woman. She's the first one we have to go to. And so it created this, you know, I always say it was divide in the room, but it was a great conversation to be having with people of like, okay, well, why did you choose those people? And they were saying, oh, well, she looked okay, and, you know, the kids looked upset, and then other people saying, yeah, but the kid's got a dog, so the kid's okay because they've got a dog, and, you know, and I go to this, so for me, I know that there's a particular photo and it's a middle-aged man and he looks quite stressed. I'm very close to my father, so I know for me that that's my go-to is to respond to that. So I have to actually, you know, pull that back and go, okay, I need to look more broadly across the group and try and identify different signals that people are in distress and things like that. And similarly, you know, when you have that cultural or gender bias and things like that. So yeah, it was a fascinating session.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
So this leads us into the next question about the issues around mix of the group.
Yeah.
Can you think of any instances where whether it be different disciplines or cultural mix? Or
There's so many groups. I'm just picturing them all back in my head now. I think first and foremost, I love the beauty of having people together and being able to have those conversations in a safe context, and for people to see different views and things like that. That's in an ideal world. And sometimes in the group you have people that have very solid views, and there's no other way that they can see it. And this does, you know, you said maybe we talk about leadership, this is probably a good place for it to come in, is that, you know, in a lot of Western organisations, when they're set up in particular structures, is about hierarchy, it is about importance of position, if I can say that. And while their intent for being in those places might be, you know, I'm sure it's genuine in every way, when you actually have other people in the groups that are challenging that or saying, I don't see it this way, or they might have lived and worked in, you know, remote places or overseas in really different contexts and things like that. I've seen in those groups this extreme power imbalance that comes in, and it's really interesting because you're within these organisations saying, oh, we're not about hierarchy and it's about flatlining and all of these sorts of things. But when it actually comes to, you don't see things how I see, that power comes straight back so quickly. So, you know, it's been a challenge, but again, I love being in this, like, this is the hot space of change for me, is being in there and just saying, well, hang on a second, can you tell us a bit more about why you think about that? And it, you know, if I go back to that picture of the woman, and for these Tiwi people to say, because we need to go and look after the elders first. And then the other group was like, oh, okay, I hadn't actually thought about that before. So it's just like a bit of a slowing down. Everyone just, you know, come back. We don't have to all be sort of fighting to be right way or the wrong way. We just need to be trying to understand the differing views and things like that.
I think that's really interesting, that concept of power within the group context, because there isn't a group where that doesn't play out. But what about the power of the group facilitators?
Yeah. Yes, they have huge amounts of power. I think there's two bits to that one for me. So one is that, you know, what's the intent and purpose? And I've spent a lot of time coaching and developing other facilitators, and I talk about the difference between being a teacher, being a trainer, and being a facilitator. So a teacher it is green. Do you understand? It is green. A trainer is, you know, there's a bit more information, but ultimately you still have to get to this one answer. And I say to people, you know, if you want to be a good facilitator, if you want to be a great facilitator, it's actually about what you can pull out of the group. So the less you say is the better job that you've done. So your job is to bring all that knowledge. You know, you've got 30 people in the room, there's times 30 knowledge of what you have. You get to be the learner and you pull that into the group. But yeah, you do see, you know, quite often people that like, again, it's like, this is the right way, I'm teaching you because this is what it is. And if it's a, you know, a shift from a, you know, like a teacher context, I guess, into a facilitator, if I can use some examples and not meaning to cause anyone offence, but, you know, a facilitator can still, if they take a particular position or view on a topic, then they can shift very much into that power balance. And so, you know, someone might go to say something and they'll go, no, that's not right, you know.
So in a co-facilitation context, how would that play out with you having a very specific role around how you see the facilitation happening and, I guess, exerting less power? And if your co-facilitator is of the teacher mode.
I know we don't mean to offend any teachers.
How would you deal with that dynamic in the group? Because that's going to be very obvious. And then it could get into people playing one against the other or call into some, you know, some of their childhood stuff. That's a really tricky one. Personally, I subscribe to the position that there's greater success in facilitating from the side. So you don't have to be the one standing up the front. And if someone wants to play that role and you can see that and the group's not actually being able to contribute with all of their ideas and not being validated, that sometimes, and I'm giving up all my secrets about, you know, when I train facilitators, because when I do this, people go, oh, I now know what you've been doing for the last 7 years. I'm like, oh no. But actually then I quite often will play the, you know, I call it the dumb card of just going, oh, could you just explain that? Like, I don't fully understand that, because what I do is I'm watching the group and they're not feeling safe enough to raise anything. So I just, well, you know, ask those questions to elicit more. And if I think it's a very sort of straight down the line and I can see there might be a different view in the group, is I might then, so I kind of put myself out as the, you know, the bait or the guinea pig to the, you know, if you want to bite, then bite me. And then let's, you know, give the group the opportunity. And so that's how I navigate it. Again, it's the relationship between the facilitators and things like that. And, you know, there's a bit of magic in being able to weave things and just gently redirect conversations and take them other ways. And group facilitation is brilliant, and it's a relationship. And if you've got co-facilitators, because you've got different views, and so you can build those relationships. And if you can have those discussions afterwards to say, oh, I don't agree, like, why do you think that? Then I think that they're really powerful. But you know, there's a huge responsibility, and I'm probably the worst person to have as a participant, because I probably do it. I'm like, oh, this is going a bit wayward. You know, who can ask a question? Because I've got a real, you know, I guess it's my sense of, you know, around social justice and fairness and equity and things like that. And if I can see that someone is really uncomfortable, and it's really interesting in the context of now everything's on Zoom, and you can see it on Zoom, like they'll start wriggling in their seats and different things, and so you're still facilitating a group and you've still got this huge responsibility to people as well. But it's a bit of a tricky one, and there's no straight answers. It's just about, I think the biggest thing is knowing who you are, what your triggers are, what your story is, you know, how you're going into that group. And, you know, my rules are keep people safe and don't make anyone feel stupid. Great. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
No, I'm just thinking I haven't done some facilitation for a while. I'm missing it, talking about it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge in this space. It's, I think it's great that you're able to come in and participate in this, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Michelle.